Come on. Come on. There we go. What the heck? 11 and 12. Come on. TikTok, go to YouTube. Get off there. Get off there, man. You're better than that. Some somber music. That's better. That's better. Something a little more lively. Oh, good. Oh. Cool, cool. TikTok, go to YouTube. Get off TikTok. Get off the tiki-taki, my friend. Not good for your soul. I think that's in the Bible. Pretty sure the Bible does say that, to not be on TikTok. I could be wrong, but I'm probably not. Go to YouTube. Go to YouTube. That's pretty neat. That's pretty neato. TikTok, you're going to want to go to YouTube. You're not going to be able to see what's on the screen, man. And it's important. So YouTube, same username. There will be a little live thing right there on the front of my profile on YouTube. Just join in there so you can see the screen. We're going to have some stuff up there that you will miss should you stay on the tiki-taki. All right, good, good, good. Got 2 minutes, TikTok. 2 minutes. Go to YouTube. Man, I want to take a nap. Oh. That's cool. Shopping. Wow. There you go. There you go. Okay, cool. Goddess Lily, what's going on? Kelsey, good to see you, ladies. We're gonna wait a couple minutes. There were a few people on TikTok that said they would move over, and we'll always wait, 3 to 5 minutes to actually roll. We've got 2 Corinthians 11 and 12. 11 and 12. These are decent little chapters too. There's a lot of good stuff in here. that's so off. Oh, I'm lovely. Just preparing mentally for Monday. Start of another beautiful, lovely week in the disaster recovery industry. Just mentally preparing. That's all. It looks like Sarah has done quite a bit to the Discord to get things fixed up and updated. It's pretty cool. We're so lucky we have her. She's so lovely. TikTok, go to YouTube. Get off TikTok. You're not going to be able to see anything, which is half the battle tonight. Granted, I read every word, but it's still nice to be able to see. It's ideal, I would say. 601. Man, she's done a lot in Discord. Sheesh, man. Looking real fancy in there. Real fancy in there. All right, wait one more minute, and then I'm just going to start rolling. Everybody's got things to go do. Get ready for the week. TikTok, go to YouTube. Go to YouTube. Same username. You're not going to be able to see over there on TikTok. Also, just don't support TikTok. It's not great, you know? Get off there. I mean, not that YouTube is much better, but maybe a little bit better. A little bit. Marginally. But we're going to roll. So we got 2 Corinthians 11 and 12. They're not super long, so we should be able to burn through them pretty quick. Ruth. About the blue and red pill guy. Oh, about the dating stuff. I know what you're talking about, Ruth. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it's sad. You know, it's the reality is that the whole dating marriage fiasco in our modern culture is like it's the fault of both parties, right? It's women's fault and men's fault. But if you're going to hold these traditional values and you're going to like claim Christian traditional values, then it's on the men to not be garbage first, not just them. Women also need to do their part, but it's on the men. Like, you can't in one sentence say, oh, I'm the man, I'm going to lead my family and I'm going to lead society because that is my role, but then complain and bitch and moan about how women are destroying everything. Like, no, I mean, set a better example. Don't participate in what it takes both parties for women to be able to do the things that the men don't like. So if the men stop pandering to it, then the women wouldn't be able to do it. And then maybe we would start to reconcile. So yeah, it's just sad. It's very sad to see men as weak as they are right now. It's extremely sad. Anyways, 2 Corinthians 11 and 12. But it is good to have you, Ruth. I'm glad we see eye to eye on that. So overview a little bit of 11. Hold on, let me get this out of my ears. I cannot focus with the music in my ears. Overview of 11, 1 through 15. In this section, Paul is going to continue to defend himself, which has been a major theme in 2 Corinthians. And there's a huge reason for that. And I'm not going to keep saying it over and over again every week. So if you don't know why that is, I'd recommend go watch the past videos that we've done. Also, I'd say if you haven't been with us, go back to 1 Corinthians. We did this same thing, live streaming chapter by chapter, verse by verse, word by word for 1 Corinthians as well. Go watch that because it's hard to get the full scope. Yeah, you can still follow along through the whole thing if you didn't listen to us going over 1 Corinthians. But does it add a massive amount of context? Yeah, of course, because 2 Corinthians is a continuation of 1 Corinthians. So if you did not get to see that, I'd highly recommend going back and watching those. But anyways, most of 2 Corinthians, Paul is defending himself. There's a reason why I've talked about it in the past videos, so we're not going to talk about it again, but just know he's going to continue to do this. It is coming from a good place. It is not a prideful thing. He's trying to get the Corinthian people to understand something. So he's trying to defend himself against the opponents. The opponents are kind of twofold. He's trying to defend himself against the Corinthian congregants, the church, because they have been indoctrinated by these false teachers. So that's the twofold. False teachers as well as the church itself. This is one of my favorite set of chapters in 2 Corinthians because he's super sarcastic a whole lot. And it's my favorite thing about Paul. And it's just massively respectable because it's easy to identify with it. His sarcasm. It's just wait. It gets real good. But anyways, he starts to sarcastically call these false teachers super apostles, which is just funny. It's very funny. He compares them to the serpent that deceived Eve, calling them false apostles and deceitful workers. Paul, he defends his ministry by pointing out that he did not accept payment while in Corinth. And we talked about that at length when we went over 1 Corinthians because it is a major theme. Paul did take financial support from other churches. Paul refused to take financial support from Corinth, and there was a reason for that, which we've talked about. Graves, good to see you. I'm really glad to hear that. Tabitha is awesome to learn about. I studied her in seminary when I did a big project on women of the Bible. Super interesting. Key player. People kind of overlook her quite a bit, but it's good to have you, and I'm glad you had a good time. Church is important. It's very good if you can find a church that you agree with what they're doing. So Paul, defending himself, wouldn't take payment from the church. There was a reason for that because he did take payment from other churches. His motive for ministry is the expansion of Christ's kingdom, not payment or respect, specifically within the Corinthian scope. TikTok. Get off TikTok. Go to YouTube. Same username. You cannot see what I have on the screen. You're going to want to see it. So anyways, that's the overview of what we're going to be looking at. So chapter 11, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Paul, right there already, so quick, is being sarcastic. The super apostles, seen in a second in verse 5, considered Paul's message and methods to be absurd. So Paul begins with sarcasm. I wish you bear with me in a little foolishness. Some of the sarcasm is hard to pick up because obviously, one, it was a very different time, so it was a different type of sarcasm. And two, we're translating sarcasm from Greek to Latin to English, and it just doesn't translate that well. But that is highly sarcastic. Do bear with me, he says, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. With divine jealousy in the green, it's also translated sometimes as godly jealousy. Not resentment or envy, but intense devotion, like the devotion God had for his own people. There's a reference to Exodus 20 that he's kind of hinting at. But Paul planted the church in Corinth. However, they rebelled against him, the people, the congregants, the church. Paul considered it his responsibility to bring them back to what he considered to be genuine faith through his godly jealousy. It's zelio in the Greek. This is the ESV. It's all you're ever going to hear me read, ever. Unless I very specifically say otherwise, but it's extremely rare unless I'm comparing something. And there's a video on my YouTube about comparing the Bible translations and why. But the short answer is because in seminary, when you learn Greek and Hebrew, ESV is as close as you get, in my opinion. In my opinion, you sacrifice some things, but the NIV, which is the most commonly used by Christians, you sacrifice too much, in my opinion, for a Bible study. For normal reading, NIV is great. It's much easier to read. For an actual study, like a word for word study, the ESV is the closest you get while it still remains readable. There are more accurate translations, kind of, but they're much harder to read. So hopefully that answered. But zelo is the word in the Greek for this godly jealousy, this divine jealousy. Then he went on in the purple there. It says, betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. Also promised you in marriage is another way that betrothal is translated. According to Jewish tradition, fathers were to present their daughters as virgins. We all, most of us, know this throughout Jewish history, and then it did kind of layer over into Christianity at the time of the New Testament. But Paul feels that the church at Corinth had been defiled by following false teachers, those super apostles, and presents this analogy to make a point. Why does he use this analogy? Culture. Is it the best analogy he could have used? No. Is it a good analogy? For sure. But the real reason that this is the way he chose to put it out there is because of culture. This was an analogy that they would absolutely be able to understand. That's the reason. So he decided to take that route. Verse 3, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Cunning is also sometimes translated as craftiness. Essentially the same thing. By extension of his analogy previously, this is a reference to deceitfulness of Paul's opponents in Corinth, again being the super apostles and some of the congregants within the church. These people cast doubt on God's promises and Paul's apostolic authority. The tie there is that Paul's apostolic authority is a promise from God. It both directly to Paul in Revelation, as well in just him understanding his purpose, but also to the Corinthian people. This was Paul's purpose, was to go around and plant these churches. That was going to be his life. After being not such a great guy for most of his life, this became his new purpose. So by questioning Paul's apostolic authority, the people at Corinth are questioning God, is kind of what he's trying to get across. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. Now, there's a lot there. Jesus, whom we have not proclaimed. Paul's opponents may have downplayed the importance of Jesus's crucifixion, since Greeks considered crucifixion to be a sign of weakness. Again, that is a cultural thing that needs to be understood when reading all of these different epistles to different churches in different cultures. You can't just read them all through the same lens. So at Corinth, they had specific beliefs due to culture. This was one of them. Crucifixion was a sign of weakness. Therefore, the Corinthian people had a very hard time dealing with the fact that their God had been crucified. By contrast, Paul presented the crucifixion of Christ as the heart of his gospel. And if you go back to 1 Corinthians, he jams it down their throat because it was such a cultural issue. They had such a massive problem with this idea of crucifixion. So Paul made a big point to make it real clear that this is a fundamental part of Christianity. So as a church plant, as congregants of the way, the new Christian movement, they had to get over it. And they had to understand this is a fundamental part of what we believe. The different spirit there in the yellow, these, what he calls super apostles, sarcastically, they had either proclaimed that Christ wasn't crucified or that his crucifixion degraded him as a savior, again, due to culture. In doing that, they preached the opposite message that Paul was preaching, who only wanted to proclaim Christ crucified. That's what Paul was doing. Paul was interested in their relationship with Jesus, but his opponents, the super apostles, were interested in their own gain. This was a financial gain. In this regard, the spirit of their teaching was one of arrogance. So one of the things we've talked about a lot within the Corinthian culture with 1st and 2nd is this issue of teachers, generally teachers. Philosophy was huge in this area demographically. They saw philosophers as these almost like holy people, these people with such a great mind that they're to be revered, they're to be on some high status because they're philosophers. So one of the big struggles Paul had, I just saw an ad come up, I skipped it. Sorry, I keep forgetting to turn that off. One of the issues Paul had with the people at Corinth was the cultural issue of them being so obsessed with these public speakers who were not godly in any way. They were heretical. So he's constantly battling the Corinthian people to understand that it's what these people, these false apostles, the super apostles are teaching is one, against Christianity, and is straight up blasphemous because they're pulling from Jesus and they're basically degrading Jesus as a savior, as a God. And then in the green, different gospel, more than likely, it's a reference to his opponent's culturally motivated attempts to undermine the importance of Jesus' sacrificial death as this fundamental, pivotal component of the gospel. The false teachers were pushing that Jesus was one, not God, or two, that because of the way he died by crucifixion makes him a lesser God. Remembering that people within all of these cultures within the New Testament, there were tons of gods. There were all these different religions stemming from paganism mostly, and they believed in dozens and dozens of different types of gods. So the false apostles were trying to get the Corinthian people, and just the Corinthian people in the congregation, but also Corinthian culture at large, to see Jesus as this lesser God. So was he God? Yeah, sure. But just like all of the other gods, he wasn't this God that was to be looked at as set apart in any way. 5. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way, we have made this plan to you in all things. So, preeminent apostles is another translation there. Again, the sarcasm. It's a sarcastic reference to the opponents of Paul at Corinth. So the super apostles, all these false teachers, whether they be philosophers or people who are strictly trying to go against Christianity very specifically. But they were trying to turn the church, his church, Paul's church, against Paul. It was one of their primary purposes. Degrade the view and vision of Christ and try to disqualify Paul as a teacher, as a preacher. These people may have also boasted about the Corinthian church as if they had planted it. So they're also trying to kind of step into Paul's place and push him out, discredit him and push him out, so that the Corinthian church would then respect these false apostles and bring them in to lead the church. It was kind of like a corporate takeover in a way. He says, unskilled in speech, but not so in knowledge. This is big, mostly just because of understanding who Paul was. Paul's speaking abilities, from everything we can gather from the Bible and texts outside of the Bible, it wasn't the best. Now, whether it just was that he, perhaps he wasn't very articulate, perhaps he wasn't very entertaining. A lot of the people specifically in Corinth, again, culturally, were great philosophers. So they could speak in a way that is easy to listen to, entertaining. They captivated people. Paul, from everything we gather, was not a captivating speaker. He was just someone who knew a lot, had experienced God personally, and was trying to share that message. But he wasn't this captivated speaker. Compare it to maybe someone who's very dry as a theologian for a biblical university or something, extremely knowledgeable. You'll learn more from this dude than most pastors. But on the other hand, you have all of these celebrity pastors who may not really know anything about theology or the Bible other than the very basic stuff, but they're able to speak in a way that gets thousands and thousands of people to listen to them. It's essentially the same thing. But Paul may be saying in the knowledge bit that he does not primarily possess knowledge, which would make this a parenthetical statement against the Corinthians, favoring of knowledge over proper understanding of the Spirit and proper use of the spiritual gifts. Again, in 1 Corinthians, big deal. Trying to get these people to understand, just because somebody doesn't speak in such a captivating way doesn't mean that they're not who you should be listening to. It's not about the way the message is delivered as much as it is about what the message is. And that is a common theme that Paul's dealing with these people constantly, over and over and over and over again. Verse 7, or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? Sarcasm. The Corinthians did not appreciate the purpose of Paul's work. This is obvious through the way that he's speaking to them in both 1st and 2nd Corinthians. They also did not respect or appreciate the hardships that he went through. The dude was stoned almost to death, and that is one of many things that happened to Paul. They really didn't care. He wasn't a good speaker. and that culturally was enough to get them turned off. It's foolish of them, obviously, it's stupid of them, to accuse Paul of wrongdoing when he endured so much suffering for the cause of Christianity. For these people who were very new within the Christian movement and who had basically been indoctrinated by outside teachers, false teachers, to come at Paul, somebody who's been around, has walked the walk, and has gone through absolute hell trying to do so, they're totally out of line, obviously, to say it short. Verse 8, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. I robbed other churches. And that translation is very good. It's an accurate translation. He's using hyperbole to try to really push or emphasize the super apostle's view of him is absurd. It's ridiculous. It's garbage. He actually raised support from the impoverished Macedonians, the Macedonian church, so that he could minister in Corinth. So he's pulling funding from other churches specifically to try to reach this demographic, this culture. And he now requests that Corinthians provide for churches with less wealth than them. If you were with us earlier in 2 Corinthians, there was a whole section about him trying to get the Corinthian people to understand why to give. Why do we give? But because there were other churches, specifically in this context, it was Jerusalem, the church at Jerusalem, that really needed help financially. Corinth was a relatively wealthy area. Jerusalem, not so much. So he was trying to get them to understand that earlier. That's what that was a reference to. I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. 9, and when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. While he was in Corinth, Paul provided for his own needs. How? That's something that everybody needs to know. Why or how was Paul able to stay self-sustainable? Because he wasn't pulling his salary. He wasn't pulling his financial, any financial gain from the Church of Corinth. He was a tent maker. At least that's what most believe, right? It's not super clear that that's all he did, but that was something that he did because it is explained that he did that. But manual labor, the dude was a manual laborer. And I would expect that he probably did a lot more than just making tents, but he did not burden anyone in that way. Verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. The boasting. Paul is taking satisfaction in preaching the gospel message without payment, which he also did in 1 Corinthians. He's taking great pleasure in the fact that he refuses to take money from them because it makes him feel like he's doing it for the right reasons. And he's more than anything, he's trying to take away anything that these people can accuse him of, because all they have done since he planted this church is accuse him of things. So he's taking pride in the fact that he's able to say, I have not taken anything from you. Shut up, essentially. Doing that allowed him to maintain his integrity, and more so maintain the integrity of the ministry. And that was the key thing for him. 11, and why? Because I do not love you. God knows I do. Because I do not love you. Those super apostles, again, might have, seemingly due to context, might have suggested that Paul did not have genuine affection for the Corinthian people, that he did not love them, because he did not allow them to share his ministry financially. Paul dismisses that accusation, those charges, that he lacks affection for the church at Corinth. God knows I do, he said. 12, and what I am doing, I will continue to do in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission, they work on the same terms as we do. Also translated, of those who would like to claim, of those who want an opportunity is another translation. Paul did not want to accept any payment from them, which distinguished him from the super apostles, who are just doing everything they possibly can to undermine Paul. They take money. The philosophers of the time, the public speakers, to say it very broadly, whether that be philosophers or preachers of a different religion, paganism, all these guys, predominantly men, who would go out in public and speak and captivate an audience, they would do so for financial gain. So it's just another example of Paul saying, look, I do all of this for nothing from you people. I've taken nothing from you. And every time you've tried to give me something, I've told you to kick rocks and that I refuse. I will not take it. He's trying to distinguish himself from the super apostles and the false teachers of the time. Pastor, it's good to see you. By the way, my wife is down to tell her story. Oh, yes. Dude, that's so exciting. That's so exciting. Your story was lovely. That was a great time. That's awesome. We will plan for that then. We'll do it probably at the end on Thursday. Tent maker Ruth. Yeah, Paul was a tent maker. That's like the standard Christian answer you're going to get. And it comes from very little information, but it is there. It's in the New Testament. If you were to just Google, is Paul a tent maker Bible verse, you'll be able to find it. It's not enough information though. So if you really dig into it, it's very likely that Paul did other stuff too, but that all of what he did was more than likely some kind of manual labor. He was some kind of builder, right? So that's hopefully that answers. If you have another question, let me know. All right, verse 13. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. Again, their whole purpose is trying to trick people away from Paul, trick people away from who Jesus actually was, and kind of indoctrinate them into their own version of Christianity, which is kind of, what ended up happening all throughout history anyways. Latter-day Saints are a good example. They keep a lot of the fundamental parts of Christianity, and then they add all this other stuff, kind of just whatever they want. But false apostles in the yellow is, again, it's a reference to the exploited, to those who were exploited within the Christian or the Corinthian church. And they exploited them for self-gain. So the false apostles, the super apostles, the false teachers, the deceitful workmen, regardless of what title he uses at any point, it's all a reference to the same group of people or groups of people. But that group is likely synonymous, or at least very similar, but more likely synonymous, meaning the same, to those that Paul sarcastically referred to as the super apostles. So more than likely, they're all the same people. They could be different groups. Some might be philosophers. Some might be religious people who are preaching and trying to take people away from. Either way, public speakers. That's why I say these public speakers, they're trying to make money. They're trying to trick people. They're trying to pull people away from the Christian church. 14. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. Angel of light. This is tricky due to translation. It seems very obvious, and in a very simple sense, it kind of is. But if you're trying to get deeper into it, it's really not. It's really not. It might be a reference to the kind of angel who ministers to believers or simply to a good spiritual being aligned with God's purposes. That is one option. This comparison suggests that the false apostles came across as genuine while inwardly desiring to destroy the church for their own gain, for their own benefit. The idea of Satan disguising himself as an angel of light recalls a very similar description of Satan's activity in various ancient Jewish writings, which is why it then gets kind of confusing. Paul, being a Jew, a previous Jew, and a very highly educated previous Jew, leaves that open for debate. So it could have been a reference to good spiritual beings who are aligned with God's purposes, but it would make almost more sense, in my opinion, and the opinion of many scholars, that it's Satan disguising himself as an angel of light is a reference to many of these other references within old Jewish writing. I guess I'll leave it right there, actually, to not go down a rabbit hole. Just understand that's a good example of how complex the Bible actually is. And if you're just reading it, you'd breeze right by that. As an angel of light. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it does. But it really could be two ends of a very wide spectrum. And if you have the information that in a lot of Near Ancient Eastern Jewish literature, they would reference this as Satan disguising himself, and they have a lot of literature about it. And then knowing who Paul is and his background and his history, then it kind of becomes a little bit more like, oh, maybe that's what he's actually talking about. Maybe it's a very specific reference, but we're breezing over it because we don't have the full context. And then his servants there in the purple, the suggestion there is that these servants, who may be the false apostles, might be the super apostles, false apostles, whatever, actually are in service to Satan, or the Satan, the enemy, and stand as a threat to the church, which when you put the two together is probably the right answer. Probably. But again, lacking information. 11, 16 through 21, this next section. The false apostles probably claimed that Paul's hardship invalidated his apostleship and made him look foolish, which is, it's their goal, is to do that. Paul turns their accusations against them. He assumes the role of a fool to make them look foolish. His discussion of his hardships exposes the false apostles as people who are self-centered. They could never demonstrate Paul and his companions' endurance for the sake of bringing people to Christ and leading a church in Jesus' way and teachings. To support the claim, Paul outlines how poorly these strong apostles have treated the Corinthians, because they've used them. They've been preying on them. Paul has done the opposite for the Corinthians, even though he has been called weak. The opposite being not preying on them, doing nothing but supporting them and taking nothing from them in return. 16, I repeat, that no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. He's always got an attitude. I love it. 17, what I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. As a fool. 18, since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. Exclamation point. 20, for you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. Foolishness. Paul might be trying to juxtapose the common Greek idea of a foolish person versus the wise person. It's a dichotomy that also appears in Proverbs several times, which Paul was, again, Jewish, highly educated. And if you actually read Paul's epistles, he constantly refers to the Old Testament. So it's very likely that that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to juxtapose a common Greek idea with an old Jewish idea. People who consider themselves wise may actually end up looking foolish in their view, if their view is based on false assumptions or on self-gratification or self-glorification. The false teachers of Corinth were foolishly ignoring the instruction of Paul, who had planted their church and led them to Christ. Paul had started the whole thing. Their behavior showed them to be foolish and weak, even though they claimed to be wise and strong. What is the point? The point is what you're actually doing will reflect who you are a hell of a lot more than what you're saying. People will always look over what you're saying, and they will always pay attention more to what you're doing, and Paul is banking on that by making good choices rather than just saying the right thing. The false apostles, the super apostles, are trying to always say the right thing, but they're always making the wrong choices. And he's trying to get them to understand that and kind of see it for what it is. Because you are wise, or being wise yourself, depending on your translation, it's another massive sarcasm. So Paul is sarcastically trying to point out how foolish the Corinthians were to believe what the false apostles were saying. He's calling them dumb in a nice way. This is made more ironic by the fact that the Corinthians considered themselves to be smart people. That's what I was saying earlier. The Corinthian demographic, their culture, was super prideful. they cared about nothing as much as they did about knowledge and philosophy. And they conflated those two things to like you being the best kind of person that walks the planet. If you have knowledge, if you're smart, and if you're a philosopher, you are like God. So Paul is spitting in their face about that concept and saying that doesn't mean anything at all. God doesn't care about it at all. And it's wildly sarcastic. I love it a lot. I love Paul very much. Enslaves or make slaves of you, depending on your translation. Paul means that, metaphorically speaking, the work of the super apostles enslaves the Corinthians. It enslaves the Corinthian believers to sin, is what he's saying. These false apostles are pushing the Corinthian people into wrong behavior, which is pushing them into sin, which is pulling them further away from Christ. That's the concept. And they're doing that by trying to kind of convey to the Corinthian people, the false apostles are doing that by trying to convey to the Corinthian people that they have this false sense of freedom, which is why back in 1 Corinthians, Paul makes a point to kind of go in depth about adiaphora. Like what does it mean to be free under Christ versus, again, staying in context, versus old Jewish rules, Mosaic law, Levitical law. He's juxtaposing often under Christ through Christianity. If you're part of the way, quote unquote, then you are under this new thing of adiaphora. Like what is right for some might not be right for all. We don't have all these very strict rules. Whereas in Jewish culture, there were wildly strict rules, super strict rules. So it's a juxtaposition of in that sense. And then devours you or devoured you. Again, the super apostles are merely using the Corinthian believers for their own benefit. That is a main theme that has to be like cemented in your mind when you're going through this text. Slaves of you. Did we already read this? I don't think so. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you or devours you. Yeah, we did. Or takes advantage of you or puts on airs or strikes you in the face. Paul uses the metaphor of being struck in the face to express the disbelief he has for the Corinthian believers in the fact that, I guess, that they, to say it simply, that they couldn't recognize that they were being misled, that they were trying to function and follow these people who were pulling them away from the gospel, not bringing them to it. And Paul is saying, yeah, I may not speak affluently, but I'm bringing you to the truth. I'm bringing you to the gospel. It's about the message. It's not about the way the message is delivered. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I love him. I am talking like a madman with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. And these are the hardships that I was referencing earlier. Paul has been through some stuff. Being stoned almost to death is just one of many things that this dude went through. Many imprisonments, countless beatings, and often near death. Kind of a big deal. Are they Hebrews, though? Paul is listing this as one of many credentials for the missionary and apostolic work that he was doing. During this time, with what was going on, and the way, the early Christian church being very new, that's kind of what ministry was. What Paul went through is what ministry looked like at that time. Because it wasn't like all of us have grown up in the US or in the UK or whatever, where Christians aren't being stoned. They're not being thrown off buildings. They're not being thrown in with the lion. Like, we don't go through that stuff. There might be a day where that happens again. Discussion for another day. But for all of our lifetimes, even if you're 80 years old, it hasn't been a thing. During that time, it was a thing. So Paul is he's being sarcastically prideful, saying, who the hell are these people? Have they gone through all this? Do they fit the criteria? Have they put the work in? He's not suggesting that being Jewish is a necessary qualification, because that's a part of the list. Are they Hebrews? But that it provides the benefit of knowing the Old Testament, which we've already briefly touched on, is that Paul had extensive knowledge of the Old Testament, which is why, pay attention when you read your Bible, when you read the New Testament, when you read the epistles from Paul, pay attention to the footnotes. Nowhere else in the New Testament, outside of Paul's epistles, will you see so many references to the Old Testament, other than sometimes when Jesus spoke. But collectively, Paul still has more. Why? Because he was a Hebrew. He is a Hebrew, was a Hebrew. He knew the Old Testament like the back of his hand. And part of his huge mission within the larger scope of the New Testament was bringing Jews to Christianity. So he was constantly trying to tie Christianity with being the fulfillment of the Old Testament. So there's constant kickbacks to the Old Testament. It's never ending. So it provides that benefit of knowing the Old Testament and being raised in the same tradition as Jesus. And his point is, these false apostles don't have that. So he's saying, in a sarcastic way, he's saying, I am better. I'm better. 23, are they? Nope, you read that. 24, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less 1. What are the 40 lashes less 1? 39 lashes were believed to be the maximum number a person could endure before dying from that kind of beating. Receiving this number of lashings served as this public warning that suggested that if you do this again, you will die for it next time. So he's saying 5 times, not once, 5 times, I received it at the hands of the Jews. So his people, origin-wise, his people, 40 lashes less 1, which is the maximum number that they believed you could endure before dying. 5 times. Not to mention the stonings, not to mention the imprisonments, and not to mention other beatings. 5 times. 25. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, false apostles, false Christians, fake lukewarm Christians, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. So what is he saying? He's saying, all of that considered, I'm also planting all of Christianity. So as I'm going through all of that crap, I'm also trying to plant and literally create the Christian faith. That's a lot. That's a lot. He's basically listing his resume right now. So would you listen to the false teachers who more than likely grew up in Corinth, which means more than likely wealthy, who don't have a background in the Old Testament from an academic level, who are new to Christianity? Or would you listen to Paul, who has gone through all of that, stayed true, came from being someone who got Christians killed, and is now putting his life in danger constantly to try to save people and bring them to Christianity? Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of things that show my weakness. The God and the Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, where he had a vision, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hand. The king was one of the Nabatean kings. The time there was 9 BC through AD 40. Even though he had the title of king, Aretas was actually a governor. Technically, was a governor. He defeated King Herod in a battle over the border dispute between Nabatea and Judea. A little history there. Lowered through a window through the wall, he said, let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. The Romans awarded their highest honor to the first soldier to scale the enemy's wall. Ironically, in comparison to the accusations that Paul was a lowly, shameful leader, Paul was lowered down a wall to escape from Damascus. He was kind of a badass. Kind of. Never ending. What are you going to say to Jesus if you get to heaven and the shelves in your mansion are crooked? What? I don't understand your first comment, dumb cat. I'm not a carpenter. I manage a restoration construction company. I am not a carpenter, though. I can barely build anything. I just am in management. I can manage carpenters. I am not skilled enough to be a carpenter. Chapter 12. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Via a vision, prophets could see God's plan for the future. That was the whole thing, right? These visions are also revealed what was happening or would happen in the spiritual world. So both our earth and outside of our reality. Here, Paul is uncertain whether he had a bodily or only a spiritual experience. Revelation there, the Greek word that is used in that specific context right here, refers to God's unveiling information that was often previously unknown or concealed. There are several words that the Greeks used for revelation. That was this one. So specific use. It's a reference to God supplying Paul with information about his particular calling. So what was Paul's purpose? Which again was to go through literal hell to essentially create the Christian faith. At other times, that word is used more broadly. And there are, in 1 Corinthians, it's used in a more broader sense. And in Galatians, it's used in a much more broad sense. This is a very specific sense. Yeah, the whole Jesus being a carpenter thing is iffy, in my opinion, historically. It's hard to say. But again, it's like you get this very small glimpse of like, oh, Jesus was a carpenter. And then for some reason, we decided it was law. To me, it's not convincing enough to be law. But I mean, perhaps he was. Or maybe he just built some stuff. And so somebody said he was a carpenter. Who knows? What type of educational background and access to text did Paul and other biblical authors have when writing their works? So that's a very deep question, and I'll tell you why. It's highly likely that Paul did not personally write all of his epistles. It's very likely that it was a mentee, someone that Paul mentored, that wrote at least some of them, perhaps. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, and it's a very long conversation. But the point is that they had access to a lot of scribes. That's how this was all done back then, right? You had an original document that somebody wrote, and then you would hire scribes to transcribe it. So you have 5 guys sitting in a house somewhere, writing off of a copy, and that's how things were passed. That's why also the Bible's not inerrant, because there are mistakes. There are mistakes all over the place. And if you go through a lot of the older copies, you can see the scribes, the people who were by hand writing the Bible off of another copy. You can see in some of the old documents where the scribes would write in the margins and scold each other for taking things out or putting things in the Bible. So the point, I guess, that's a totally different conversation, but they had just documents. Basically, they had handwritten scriptures that they had access to. And that would go for everybody. That was Paul and anybody else. I mean, there was obviously no technology. There was no printing press. So depending on where you were geographically and what culture you were in specifically, you might have a larger library or a smaller library. Within Corinth, they probably had a decent library because Corinth had money. It was a higher status demographic. So they probably in this area, but you have to remember, Paul was moving around all the time. So he was never really in one place. And you can only carry so much with you. And we don't know anything about Paul's upbringing other than that he was very educated. So what that looked like, I have no idea, Scott, no clue. But we get the indication that Paul was highly educated. And then when you go through his epistles, it's super obvious. He at least knew the Old Testament really well because he referenced the Old Testament constantly. Kind of like Jesus. Jesus would reference the Old Testament in a very beautiful way. And that indicates that he knew the Old Testament really well. Outside of like proof by write or reading and seeing his comments, it's hard to say. We don't have anything that tells us, they learned in this way and the libraries look like this. We don't have it. I know a man in verse 2. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. I know a man. It appears that Paul is using the third person. Maybe. This is another tricky one. So he could possibly be describing his own experience. He may have done this to avoid boasting. However, at the same time, he's done nothing but boast. So contextually, I have kind of a hard time with that. But this may have also been a typical... Let me try to think about how to say this. You see similar things in other prophetic work, I guess would be the best way to say that. So contextually, it doesn't really make sense because Paul's been kind of boasting, whether it's sarcastically most of the time, but also just truthfully other times in these past 2 chapters. So contextually, it wouldn't really make sense to me. In other prophetic literature, you see this type of third person view though. So it could be. It just doesn't make perfect sense. Isaiah penned his own account of his vision in Isaiah 6. Then that would have been third person. So there's one example within Isaiah of perhaps he's talking about himself. I just want to be clear, I guess, and this is totally my opinion. I think it's 50-50. It could go either way. He could be talking about himself. He could definitely be talking about somebody else, though. 14 years ago, this event that he's referencing happened sometime roughly between AD 41 and 43, depending on the precise date of 2 Corinthians. And this, just for you guys who were watching the movie with us, this is why I have an issue with that movie. Scholarship has no idea fully when any of these epistles were written or when the Old Testament was written. So the whole 2030 timeline, it all hinges on dozens of different dates of writings that we don't actually know when they were. I mean, 2 Corinthians is a 3-year window that most of scholarship gives it. So if I'm functioning off of a 3-year window, keeping it super simple, that means the Messiah 2030 might be 2030 or might be 2033. Now conflate that with how many different dates they did. Like I don't know, to me, there's no way you could say exactly this year, because we don't know when most of the Bible was written. We have like very rough windows of when it was written, no specifics. Third heaven in the red. It's a reference to the highest heaven. You can read about that in 1 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and also Psalm. And I want to say it's in Proverbs too, but I honestly don't remember. Paul's reference is probably intentionally vague for a reason. And it may simply be to serve contrast to the place where God and heavenly beings dwell against our reality. So in contrast to where spiritual beings reside to where we reside in this reality, on this plane of reality, or however you personally like to picture that. If Paul does have a precise place in mind, then he's probably thinking of the third heaven as the highest heaven, and that being the place of God's actual presence. So that being where God physically, I guess if you could say that, physically actually is, where God actually is. Verse 3, and I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. In the body or out of the body. Paul's obviously uncertain about whether the man was in his physical body during that experience, that revelation, that vision. The man who, again, could be Paul or could be someone else. He could be talking about himself in the third person. He could be telling a story about somebody else. May have been literally taken into heaven and then returned to earth. Or he may have simply undergone a spiritual or mental experience of some kind. Again, we don't know. If you go back to Acts 9, Paul clearly experiences Christ bodily, in a bodily way. There, Christ came to him on earth. Here, Paul went to Christ in heaven, in at least a spiritual sense. But he's saying that possibly also physically. So in Acts, Jesus came to Paul in a physical way. Here, he's saying that if he is talking about himself, he went to heaven. But he doesn't know whether it's just in a spiritual way or a physical way or possibly both. He's saying he doesn't know, which again is part of the reason why I don't really like the whole Paul talking about himself in the third person. It seems less likely that's the case to me. That's an opinion. He was caught up. No, actually, we'll get to that in a minute. Check on my chronological order of the New Testament. Yeah, I have it like on a laminated sheet in one of my binders for reference. It's really good to have that. When things were written chronologically, it adds a lot of context. Generally agreed the longest person can live. So the longest generation, 1968, Isaac Newton calculated Jesus would return about 2060, right in the ballpark. I think Paul was talking about himself in the third person. Paul was quite clever. For sure. He was totally clever. I just contextually, it doesn't really make sense to me. If you consider everything else. I guess for the reason why. All of the other context to me makes sense of what he's saying, because it does reflect his life. It's just odd that he decides to change it there instead of earlier. It's just odd. But who knows, man? And does it really change anything? Not at all. Not even a little bit. God knows, and he heard things that cannot be told, which a man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast. There, is he talking about himself? Is he talking about someone else? Who knows? I will boast, but on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Let me see real quick. Okay, we're good. 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. So, yeah, let's do that. Here's from me, or here's anything from me. If all of these events happened to Paul, then here he's revealing his motivation for not speaking about this experience directly in the first person. He does not want others to view him as special or elite. The reason I have an issue with that is because not one chapter ago, he was kind of boasting about how he's better than the false apostles. So if it's a comparison to him and still the super apostles, it makes no sense at all. If he's now just comparing himself to people in general, or perhaps the church in general, or his brothers in Christ in general, then it would make more sense, which is why it's still a plausible idea. I think it's totally plausible. It's just, it could go either way. A thorn was given to me, a messenger of Satan. There's a lot in all of that. The use of the passive verb was given indicates that Paul considered God to be responsible for the thorn, which I feel like most Christians view it that way because it was ultimately used for a good purpose. A thorn is Paul's inner struggle. It's this internal struggle and emotional turmoil about the church's condition. An ongoing sin, his opponents, like the super apostles, a physical ailment, his speaking ability, demonic opposition, all of it, all options could be possible, considering the circumstances and considering what Paul was just talking about last chapter. The thorn could have been any of it. There are references all over the New Testament to Paul's struggles. So it could be in reference to any of it. A messenger. The Greek word is a very commonly used word, which translates to angel. This may be a reference to an evil being, because in a lot of Near Ancient Eastern literature, angel was used for evil beings as well. It could also be a reference to a human opponent who had caused him great pain. Within this context, it's probably one or the other, though. By using the term Satanas for Satan, he's obviously talking about something that is evil. There's something that is antithetical to Christ, that is antithetical to God, and that is working evil in the world actively. It's not clear whether Paul had associated the thorn with a human messenger or a spiritual messenger. He's explicitly identifying it with the figure of Satan, though, which is more of an indication that it's probably a spiritual entity, but in no way is it clear. Satan obviously intended Paul massive amounts of harm, and put him through harm, but it intended it. But God ultimately and always had pulled through for Paul. He had never let him down. He let him struggle, but he never actually let him down, which is always this great display. And the reason that Paul is such a beautiful example of what a Christian is, or what a Christian should be, I guess, should be. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 3 times. Echoing the number of times Jesus asked the Father to keep him from suffering on the cross. Paul took great pride in suffering because of what Christ went through. You read about it all the time in Paul's epistles. He prided himself on going through suffering because he felt that it brought him closer to Christ, understanding Christ. It's an emphasizing that he had pled his case before God and that God had chosen to allow him to experience it and continue. Keep on going. Paul believed God will always use those types of situations for good, and it's very clear in virtually all of Paul's writing. Concern for the Corinthian church. I've been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you, for I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The sign of a true apostle were performed among you with the utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you. Sarcasm, sarcasm, sarcasm. You gotta love it. Forgive me this wrong. Sarcasm. Forgive me this wrong. He's saying all of the other churches I planted, I took from them. I gave to them massively, but I had no problem taking from them because we had a healthy relationship. With you miserable people, because of your constant accusations and mistrust in me, I never burdened you with any of that. And yet you still do this to me. I treat you like a favorite, and you still do this to me. Forgive me this wrong. Sarcasm. Here, for the 3rd time, I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden. So, key note right there. For the 3rd time, I am ready to come to you. Paul first visited Corinth during his 2nd ministry. Go to Acts 18. He refers to his 2nd visit there as the painful visit, and we read about that in chapter 2 of this book, 2 Corinthians. Indication, there are lost letters to the Corinthians, widely agreed upon throughout scholarship, that 1st and 2nd Corinthians are 2 of 3 or 4 total letters that went to that church. They were lost. We don't have them. I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. I don't seek what you have to give me. I seek you. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but their parents for their children. The wealthy believers in Corinth wanted to become Paul's patrons. Again, constantly offering him money, supplying him with financial support, all throughout 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Paul consistently, constantly, and perpetually is reminding them that their relationship to him is the opposite. That Paul will provide for them because they are immature, instead of them providing for Paul. He's not going to take from them. The Father provides for them, not the children providing for the Father. Other churches, he didn't approach like that because they were not like these people. He had a very hard time with these people. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? But granting that, I myself did not burden you. I was crafty. Paul is sarcastically addressing their concerns to provide for him. He's sarcastically addressing their issue with trying to support him. Paul treats the idea as ridiculous. He's being sarcastic. He's saying this is absurd. This is asinine, and insists that he would not take advantage of them. So he's trying to press the point, press the point, press the point, press the point. You say, and got the better of you by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? Any of the other brothers like Titus? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother, which is one of the unnamed brothers from 2 Corinthians, with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act in the same spirit? Meaning, did we not come at you with humility? Did we not take the same steps? 19. Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your building, beloved. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. That perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and had not repented. Oh no, I just lost. And have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced. The list right here: quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. The sins Paul lists are an echo of the works of the flesh he listed in Galatians. So if you go to Galatians 5, 19 through 21, it's an echoing of that list. So those vices are sins against the community, which had become a massive problem at the Church of Corinth, and created division among believers, which is why he ended it with disorder. All of these things had caused massive disorder, confusion, arguments, and basically the breakdown of the Corinthian church. And they were cultural issues. They were pagan issues. Because a lot of Corinthians, if you go back to 1 Corinthians, a lot of the Corinthians were going back to paganism, but staying within the church. So they were going back and practicing paganism, bringing pagan concepts and ideas into the Christian church, and it was causing massive issues with the people in the church. Obviously, it was a big problem. That's that. So that's 11 and 12. Next Sunday will be 13 and 14. Oh no, we're done. We're done. 13. So actually, we gotta decide what we're doing next. So next week, what we'll do is we'll finish 13, and we will start whatever we're reading next. I'll probably run a poll in Discord. So anybody who wants to have a say in what book we go into next, make sure you check Discord. I will send an alert out for it though, so to keep your eyes on that. Just so you guys know too, if you come to Discord and you look at the channels and roles right under the events tab, you can hit this. Do you want notifications for live streams and uploads? So if you turn that on, when I do announcements, I swear I don't abuse this feature. So you're not going to get a bunch of notifications. I do it maybe twice a week. But when I come and when I post the poll in the announcements, I do @alert. And if you click this, yes, anytime I tag @alert, you'll get a notification for it. So if you want to be privy to the polls as they get posted, or anything that's like super important that I tag like that for, then just make sure you turn that on. You can also turn on and off channels in here, just so you guys are aware. I know Discord is confusing. So those are features, they are there, that is possible. And just know that Sarah is working very hard to try to update Discord, because we had some issues with a recent update they did. So she's killing it, trying to get things put back together. So just be patient. If things don't work right, let us know so that we can, focus on trying to get it figured out. Paul, thanks. 1 Corinthians 5:9 refers to an earlier letter Paul sent to the church. 2 Corinthians also refers to another letter written in tears. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And we went into that pretty deep when we went over chapter 2 in 2 Corinthians. That all through seminary, 7 years, I've yet to meet a distinguished scholar who disagreed. Everybody I met in scholarship throughout, my learning experience was like, yeah, there were definitely 3 or 4 letters to the Corinthian church. And a lot of them actually believed that they were destroyed because Paul eventually kind of lost his mind and was angry, not like crazy, but that for some reason the early church wanted to get rid of them, which I believe wholeheartedly, because Paul could kind of get out of control a little bit. And when you consider this church, they were awful. They were bad. But if you compare this church to like modern day church, I think they were probably nothing compared to us. Yeah, shout out to Sarah. She's a godsend. Those venomous literalists. Who exactly received the letters of the church in Corinth, and what was their response? I'm not going to say, because I don't know off the top of my head. And I'm trying to remember if we went into that at any point, and I don't want to say, because I honestly do not remember. I don't know if we know that. I'm sure there are some guesses. I'm sure you could find some names, but you have to go outside of the Bible. So how much weight are you going to put into it? I guess it would depend on where the information's coming from. So I'd be super careful with stuff like that. If you're able to find something that says like a specific name of who received the letters, if it's not Titus, like if Titus was there when the letter was sent, I'd add more validity to it. But honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I knew at one point. Maybe I never knew. I don't know. That's those are little things that take up space in your brain that I don't have. Ali. Yeah. I don't know. I believe it, man. I believe that they were probably destroyed. Just because it would make sense. He probably got super pissed at some point. Or they got into a spat back and forth. Or, the early church was corrupt, man. This idea that like everything we have is perfect and unaltered is like one, it's been proven wrong 1,000 times over. So for people to keep saying the Bible is inerrant, I just don't. You're using a different definition of that word, because inerrant means perfect and untouched and unchanged. The Bible has dramatically been changed. It's been touched a whole lot. The scribes themselves talk shit to each other in the margins as they transcribed it, because they're like, hey, don't change that. You are a fool. Don't change that. Like the scribes themselves admit the Bible has been altered. Let's just admit it and move on. Doesn't make it less doesn't mean it has less validity. No. But you need to be honest. Hey man, I've been watching you throughout the years and it's been amazing to watch your spiritual journey. Yo, that's cool. You must have been on YouTube then, because I've only been on TikTok for like 6 months. But that's awesome. You need to go to YouTube though. We got people over here in the chat. You're gonna be all by yourself over there in TikTok land. Especially if you've been watching for years, man. Go to YouTube. We do this 2 or 3 times a week. It'd be good to have you over there in the chat, because normally I wouldn't even see. Yeah, YouTube is the OG platform. Yeah, go back to YouTube, man. I barely ever even look over here. I just leave it up and then tell people to go to YouTube. It's awesome though that you've been around. If you had me on Instagram, send me a DM. I want to see if I remember you. But thanks for popping in, man. I hope to see you over there. We also have a Discord. You should try to get in the Discord. There's a link on my profile there on TikTok. There's awesome people in the Discord. It's a really, really good group. Are there remnants of the church in Corinth available to reference? You mean like physical remnants? Like if you were to travel there now? I believe the answer is no. But again, I could definitely be wrong. These are things that I don't, I haven't made a point to retain. Of all the things I read and listen to, the important stuff stays, the less important stuff goes. I honestly don't know, man. The Jewish crew took those letters. I've heard in some early Christian churches, crazy stuff like women calling out the name of the goddess Diana was going on, disrupting the service. Yeah, that's pretty verified. Which is why there's a decent argument for why when Paul was essentially saying women should shut up in the church, it was for a specific reason. Because it was, if you remember, he basically tells women to be quiet in the church. And then he says, when you get home, you can ask your husbands questions. So it leaves room for argument that women are not to shut up in church. That's not what he's saying. More than likely, it's not what he's saying. Women were doing something very specific during church service. And he's saying, yo, be quiet during church. Ask your husbands questions when you're home. Don't be blurting things out in the middle of a service, which contextually, big picture, makes a hell of a lot more sense than women are not to speak or teach within a church, especially when you consider the Corinthian context, which a lot of women were doing exactly what you're saying, and they were calling on names of other gods in the church. So it would make sense, like, if women predominantly, and none of this is fact, this is all a culmination of context from everywhere. If women in Corinth were practicing paganism and claiming Christianity, which they were, then perhaps during church services or in groups of Christians, they were either speaking of paganism or loudly asking things in regards to Christianity compared to paganism. Either way, within that context, it would make some sense that Paul's like, hey, shut up. Shut up. If you have questions or you need help, talk to your husbands after we're done. Talk to your husbands later. Right now is not the time. Which I lean more that way. And I'm not saying women should or should not be pastors. It's a totally different conversation. But within this specific topic, I don't think women are to not speak in church. I think it was a very specific thing, especially if you're going to pull from Corinthians, which was the most broken church during that early movement. We shouldn't be basing anything we're doing off of Corinthian issues. Unless your church is acting like Corinth, then sure. But they're not general directions for Christian living. It's Paul scolding a very specific church with a very specific people doing very specific stuff within that demographic. It's not to be applied to every Christian. And he even says that in 1 Corinthians. He goes into detail about how that is not how Christianity is to be done. All right, any last minute stuff, guys? I didn't realize how late it was, man. We went freaking late for a Bible study. I gotta run. I gotta see the lady before Monday. The hell starts again. I will post a poll. If you haven't, go vote on the poll for Thursday though. We've got weather manipulation, are disorders and diseases curses. And if you haven't seen the most recent Hillsong fiasco, we're going to be playing that video. And main theologies within Christianity in detail, comparing and contrasting. So if you haven't voted yet, go vote. And then I'll post another poll here in just a minute for what book you guys want to do next for Sundays. And then we'll get into that. But I am out for the night. You beautiful, lovely people. I hope you all have a wonderful night. And I will see you in the Discords. You're all lovely. Later.